I was polishing my notebook the way one polishes a conscience, half out of duty, half out of boredom, when the bell rang at precisely 10:15. I glanced at Wolfe, who was reclining in his chair as though gravity had given up on him entirely. His eyes were closed, but I knew better that Wolfe's idea of rest is merely a deceptive pose, while the wheels of his mind grind like a locomotive on full steam. "Archie," he murmured without opening his eyes. "Another interruption?" "You could say that," I replied. "Somebody's here with a proposition." He made a sound that might have been a snort, or it might have been the inhalation of refined annoyance. "A proposition," he said, carefully. "Explain." I opened the front door before he could decide whether to grace me with further interrogation. A woman stood there, impeccably dressed, with the sort of calm certainty that says, "I've arrived for a reason, and I won't leave until it's attended to." She carried a small leather satchel and wore gloves that were just slightly too tight for comfort. "Mr. Wolfe?" she said, a statement more than a question. Her voice had a clipped elegance, a precision that could have been forged in a corporate boardroom or a courtroom. "I require your expertise." I stepped aside, letting her in. Wolfe opened one eye, surveying her like a general examining a new recruit for hidden faults. "And what might that expertise be?" he asked, finally, still seated, perfectly composed. "My name is Helena Marwick," she said, placing the satchel on the nearest table. "I am a consultant in the culinary arts and an investigator of culinary sabotage." She paused, as if testing the waters. "I believe someone has tampered with my client's products and her proprietary spice blends. I need to know who and why." Wolfe's single eye flicked toward me briefly, a silent acknowledgement that he had heard correctly. "You speak of theft," he said, "or mere incompetence?" "Neither," Helena replied. "This is deliberate, strategic. Someone wishes to ruin the reputation of Marwick & Co. My client's Tarragon blend has been compromised repeatedly, each time subtly enough that it goes unnoticed by most, but with enough damage to raise suspicion among the chefs who rely on her." I caught Wolfe's other eye twitch. That was enough to tell me he was already calculating angles in his mind, even if his face remained the epitome of unmoved detachment. "I assume you've tried conventional methods?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Internal audits, background checks on staff. Nothing has yielded results. I've traced a pattern over the past 3 months. That is why I've come here." I leaned against the desk. "So in short, someone's poisoning your client's Tarragon, and you want the brain of Nero Wolfe to fix it." Helena didn't blink. "Exactly." Wolfe finally sat up, steepling his fingers. "And why come to me, Mrs. Marwick, instead of calling the authorities?" "Because," she said carefully, "the authorities cannot act without proof, and proof requires expertise beyond surveillance. I have witnesses, I have observations, but it is your reputation for deduction, your reputation for insight, that I trust to untangle the invisible hand behind this." He tapped a finger against his chin, considering. "Insight is not a commodity," he said, almost absently. "It is earned through observation and deduction. Why should I accept this case? Because," she said, tilting her head with a faint smile, "the destruction is deliberate, intellectual. It is artistry with malice, and I have reason to believe it involves someone you might know." The room went cold, not physically, but with the sudden gravity of implication. Wolfe didn't react outwardly, but I felt it like a taut wire under invisible fingers. "I see," he said. "Tell me everything." She opened her satchel, extracting a series of documents and photographs. I caught a glimpse of the handwritten notes, spice samples, and what appeared to be faint, almost microscopic smudges on the jars themselves. She had traced delivery routes, timing of complaints, and peculiar notes from chefs noting unusual aroma. "Observe carefully, Mr. Wolfe," she said. "The pattern is subtle but deliberate. Only someone with a methodical mind could deduce the perpetrator from these scattered hints." I watched Wolfe handle the evidence with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for rare orchids. He smelled, inspected, turned over labels with the precision of a man dissecting a complex equation. His gaze, once fixed, never wavered. "I will take this case," he said finally, his voice as smooth as aged bourbon. "Not for Tarragon, Mrs. Marwick, nor for the gratitude of your client, but for the intellectual exercise it offers. One cannot lightly ignore deliberate malice executed with cunning." Helena's lips curled slightly. I anticipated as much. I offered a dry whistle. "That's unusually eloquent even for you, Wolfe." "Mr. Goodwin," he said, leaning back, preparing to observe and record. "I shall conduct the investigation from here. You will follow the leads I deem relevant." And just like that, our quiet Tuesday had been shattered. A new case had arrived, and it was personal in the most intellectual of ways. My instincts told me this would not be simple. Helena rose, smoothing her gloves, her presence still commanding the room despite the lack of overt hostility. "I will leave you to your methods, expect my client's trust, and her kitchen toe be at your disposal." Wolfe gave no reply. He never does when satisfied. That was a conversation in itself, a silent confirmation. As she left, I couldn't resist a smirk. "Well, boss, looks like we're entering the world of gourmet sabotage. Have you ever thought about Tarragon?" "I think about misdeeds, Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe replied, voice flat, eyes returning to his chair, "and the minds that commit them." I knew then that this wasn't going to be just a theft or a spoiled jar of spice. Someone had aimed for strategy and subtlety, and Wolfe had already accepted the challenge. I made a note in my notebook, the one that never lies: Tarragon, sabotage, mind games, and probably someone in the kitchen with a taste for trouble. Let the hunt begin. The brownstone never liked strangers, and I can't say I blame it. The place has a personality of its own, graceful, imperious, and intolerant of noise or chaos. So when Helena Marwick arrived, carrying her aura of precise urgency, the house reacted immediately. Fritz's footsteps became slightly more deliberate in the kitchen, the faint clink of china more pronounced. Wolfe, of course, remained unmoved in his chair, but even he couldn't completely mask that subtle tightening around the eyes. I followed Helena into the office, careful not to trip over the tension that seemed to radiate from every corner of the room. "You know, Wolfe," I said, leaning against the desk, "I think the house is trying to throw us out before we even start." "I find it mildly amusing that you anthropomorphize bricks and mortar," Wolfe replied without looking up. Helena didn't miss a beat. "I've heard of the brownstone's temperament. It is unique. I trust it will not interfere with your methods." Wolfe's single eye flicked to her. "It will not interfere. But you, Mrs. Marwick, must understand the brownstone has a sense of propriety. Anyone who disrupts it without purpose invites scrutiny. I do not act in haste, and neither do my surroundings." I stifled a laugh. "By which you mean, don't step on my turf or you get the silent treatment." She smiled faintly, but there was something guarded in her expression. "I am aware of the rules, Mr. Wolfe. I assure you, my business is entirely legitimate." Meanwhile, I couldn't help noticing the minor disturbances that came with her presence. A chair shifted slightly more than necessary when she sat. A rug, which had lain perfectly aligned, was now just fractionally askew. Not that it mattered to me, but Wolfe, ever alert, seemed to note every microscopic deviation. "Archie," he said at last, "observe and report. There are nuances here that may escape ordinary attention. Every detail counts. I raised an eyebrow. You mean notice that she doesn't quite line up the papers, or that Fritz's soufflé might take offence at a new aroma? I mean exactly that, he replied, unflinching. One cannot understand intent without noting context. A bent paperclip, a shifted vase, a slightly ajar door, these are not accidents. They are indications, if interpreted correctly, of character, temperament, and possibly guilt. Helena, clearly unfazed by the verbal sparring, set about unpacking her evidence. There were small jars, a few envelopes of correspondence, and annotated recipes. Each seemed innocuous, but Wolfe's scrutiny made them seem like weapons in some invisible battle. "You work in culinary sabotage," I said, nodding at the array. "So this isn't just about a missing spouse's strategy. Someone's turning kitchens into a chessboard." "Exactly," Helena said, her voice steady. "It's subtle, psychological. The chefs begin to doubt themselves. The client loses credibility. Reputation erodes not by theft, but by unseen malice." Wolfe finally leaned forward, the chair creaking slightly under his weight. "And you expect me to untangle these layers from my chair?" "I do," she said without hesitation, "because you see what others cannot. Patterns, motives, logic. You don't need to touch the pots, you need to read the players." I watched Wolfe consider this. He didn't move, didn't frown, didn't sigh. But I could see the gears in his mind turning, calculations, deductions, hypotheses forming and discarding themselves in a fraction of a second. "Very well," he said finally. "We will begin. Mrs. Marwick, you will leave the documents here." Archibald Goodwin, he shot me a glance that could cut through steel and perform reconnaissance as I directed. "We shall see who disturbs Tarragon with such deliberation and intent." I made a mental note that reconnaissance in Wolfspeak meant I was about to be sent into the streets doing all the legwork while he orchestrated from above. Fine by me as long as the brownstone stayed intact. As Helena departed, leaving the office thick with the scent of her subtle perfume and a trace of tarragon in the air, I couldn't help noticing that even the curtains seemed to lean in, as if curious. The brownstone had been disturbed, indeed, and the game, as Wolfe would undoubtedly phrase it, had begun. I lit my first cigarette of the morning, considering the players and the board. A challenge had arrived quietly, elegantly, and with far-reaching consequences. I just hoped nobody expected me to be delicate in my reporting. By mid-morning, I had mapped out the first layer of the problem. Someone with access, opportunity, and subtle cunning had been meddling with Marwick's tarragon. Wolfe, naturally, had no intention of leaving the brownstone, so my legs were about to earn their keep. I lit a cigarette, ran a hand through my hair, and reminded myself that observation, not confrontation, was the key. The first stop was the supplier's warehouse. I was greeted by a man named Douglas Rains, who, judging by his posture and the slight tremor in his hand, was more nervous about me than about any actual wrongdoing. I noted everything: the way his eyes darted, the precise timing of his responses, the faint smell of pipe tobacco mingled with the scent of herbs. Nothing overtly incriminating, but patterns are built from subtleties. "Mr. Rains," I began, leaning casually against the counter, "I hear there have been some discrepancies in deliveries, unusual spoilage, missing jars, maybe a blend that didn't quite pass muster." He nodded cautiously. "We've had issues, nothing major, but some chefs did complain." "I swear it's nothing deliberate." I raised an eyebrow. "Of course, but you'd agree that patterns over time can reveal intent." Rains shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose. But it's mostly logistics, temperature control, humidity, and human error. We've tightened procedures." "Good," I said, not pushing further. The goal was to seed the idea that I was listening closely while I measured his reactions to the subtleties, the nuances. I left him sweating in the small, herb-scented office and made a note in my pad: Raines, nervous, cooperative, no overt malice, potential pawn. Next, I visited Marwick's client-side chefs, the very people who had been reporting the subtle degradation in flavour. Chef Lydia Harrow, a petite woman with sharp eyes and an opinion on everything from knife angle to tarragon potency, welcomed me with a wary stare. "You're the detective, yes? From Wolfe?" "Archie Goodwin," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "And yes, I'm here to understand what's been going wrong with your supplies." She crossed her arms. "It's nothing huge, just a faint bitterness, a misaligned aroma. But it happens enough to make me second-guess the brand. Some days I think someone is trying to make us look incompetent. Bingo, subtle psychological pressure." I asked about access to the kitchen, storage routines and delivery times. Her answers were precise, rehearsed almost, but her hands betrayed a flicker of frustration whenever she mentioned particular delivery days. I made a mental note: Harrow knowledgeable, meticulous, sensitive to timing, possibly aware of manipulation beyond supply issues. The third person in our circle was Reginald Marks, the operations manager of Merrick & Cote. A tall, lean man with a hawkish nose and a clipped way of speaking, he greeted me with a handshake that was firm but cold. "Detective," he said, "I hope you can get to the bottom of this. Our reputation is on the line." I asked about staff turnover, recent disciplinary actions, and any internal conflicts. Mark's responses were slick, polished, but I caught a brief twitch when I mentioned a former assistant named Talbot Crane, someone recently dismissed for minor theft. His reaction was too quick, too instinctive. Mark's controlled, proud, protective of company image, reaction to Crane notable. Finally, I sought out the quietest player in this game, the night custodian, Marvin Dean. I found him in a dimly lit storage corridor, sorting empty spice jars. His hands were steady, his expression neutral, but the way he handled the tarragon jars suggested familiarity beyond simple janitorial duty. "In the evening," I said, casually. "Notice anything unusual lately?" Dean shook his head, slow and deliberate. "People mess up. Chefs, suppliers, mistakes happen, but no one would deliberately." He hesitated, then continued, "Well, maybe someone. Hard to tell." I noted that hesitation. Not a confession, but a crack in the armor. Dean a low profile, observant, knows the routine, possible facilitator or witness. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was already at the office table, hands folded, eyes glinting. He gestured to the documents Helena had left. And he asked, "What have you observed?" I laid out the impressions, careful to emphasize patterns, reactions, and subtleties. Rains is nervous but cooperative. Harrow is frustrated, precise, aware of timing issues. Marks is polished, protective, and reacts sharply to Crane's name. Dean is hesitant, observant, possibly complicit without realizing it. Wolfe listened without comment, fingers tapping lightly against each other. "And the flavor anomalies themselves?" he asked. "Subtle," I replied. "Bitterness just enough to cause doubt, aroma slightly off on certain delivery days, timing consistent with specific batches from the warehouse." He nodded, eyes narrowing. "It is strategic, not clumsy. The intent is to destabilize confidence, to manipulate perception. This is not a crime of opportunity, it is a crime of intellect, and it involves someone who understands both kitchen operations and human psychology." I leaned back, impressed, despite myself. Wolfe's ability to distill motives from minutiae never ceased to amaze me. "So basically, we're looking for someone smart, meticulous, and subtle enough to make chefs question their own palates." "Precisely," he said. "And now that we have identified the possible suspects, observation will continue. Your role, Goodwin, is to document inconsistencies, reactions, and, if possible, trace movements that coincide with the altered deliveries. Timing, alignment, access, these are our key parameters." I nodded, stubbing out my cigarette. The brownstone felt heavier now, charged with anticipation. The circle of suspects had been defined, and each person carried a piece of the puzzle. But one element remained clear. Someone among them was deliberately undermining trust, and the path to exposing them would require patience, perception, and a keen eye for human nature. I knew Wolfe would remain in his chair, orchestrating, observing, and I, as always, would be the one stepping into the world, following threads others didn't see, piecing together the quiet havoc that had been unleashed over something as seemingly innocuous as a jar of tarragon. The investigation had gained its first true momentum. The suspects were laid out like pieces on a chessboard, each move calculated, each reaction meaningful. And somewhere among them, the mind that had initiated this subtle campaign waited, confident that its work might go unnoticed, until Wolfe and I began to look a little closer. The streets of New York have a rhythm, a pulse, that can tell you more than any suspect ever will if you know how to listen. I spent the morning tracing deliveries, shadowing couriers, and observing patterns that at first glance seemed innocuous. Every van leaving Marwick&Cozen, every handoff of a crate, every pause at a doorway was a potential clue. Wolfe had given me my marching orders to follow, observe, record, and do not engage unless absolutely necessary. My first stop was the downtown distribution hub, a bustling mess of crates, forklifts, and workers who looked at me the way you look at a cat inspecting a dog show. I lingered near the spice section, noting who touched what, who paused to inspect jars, who left spaces slightly askew. There were 2 couriers who handled the Tarragon batches differently, one careful, meticulous, gloves, spotless, the other impatient, rough, tossing boxes with little regard. I recorded everything mentally, then stepped back to note reactions. The meticulous courier, a young man named Lewis, seemed tense, almost overly attentive to detail. His eyes flitted toward the loading dock manager every few seconds, as though seeking approval. The rougher courier, by contrast, exuded confidency or overconfidence, small, seemingly insignificant details. The angle of his wrist when he lifted a crate, the way he sniffed a jar before placing it, the fleeting glance toward a parked delivery van, these all mattered. From there, I moved to the recipient locations, the kitchens themselves. Chef Harrow's reaction to late or irregular deliveries was predictable. She fussed, recalibrated her orders, and made a note in her logbook. But one day, a delivery arrived that seemed perfectly timed, perfectly aligned, yet the aroma was faintly off. Harrow noticed, but hesitated to complain. That hesitation told me someone was interfering subtly, intentionally creating doubt without overt sabotage. Next, I visited Reginald Marks's office under the pretense of a routine follow-up. He greeted me with the same clipped politeness, though there was an edge I hadn't noticed before. "Goodwin," he said briskly, "I trust your observations are proving useful." "Useful enough to notice a few patterns," I said casually, letting the words hang in the air. "Some deliveries appear altered or delayed in ways that don't align with usual logistics." Marks's brow twitched ever so slightly. "We've been having issues with supply chains," he said smoothly. "Nothing that shouldn't be managed internally." "Of course," I replied, watching his hands. Subtle tightening of the fingers, a quick glance at a nearby ledger, small, human tells that suggested awareness, perhaps even involvement. Not proof, but enough to put him on the mental chessboard. By late afternoon, I had amassed a dossier of observations, delivery timings, minor inconsistencies, staff reactions, and one suspicious courier who seemed almost too diligent in his care. Wolfe would want all of this arranged clearly, every pattern noted, every irregularity highlighted. Returning to the brownstone, I found Wolfe in his chair, the corners of his mouth faintly twitching, a sign of suppressed satisfaction. He took the papers I handed him without a word, scanned them and finally said, "You have observed, recorded, and interpreted. Now we begin the subtle cross-referencing of these events with the suspect's personal tendencies. Discrepancies will reveal themselves." I lit a cigarette and watched him work. He moved pieces of paper around, consulted notes, and made notations in his precise script. Each observation I had made found its place, like threads woven into a tapestry. Slowly, patterns emerged. The meticulous courier corresponded with days the Tarragon seemed most subtly altered, his route intersecting with someone within Marwick & Co.'s. His kitchen staff and the faint aroma changes matched the batches he handled. "See anything interesting?" I asked, leaning over the edge of the desk. Wolfe didn't look up. "Patterns, Goodwin. Patterns, timing, behavioral deviations. The manipulation is deliberate, orchestrated to create the appearance of randomness. Whoever is responsible understands human nature as much as they understand spice handling. That is why mere observation will yield results." I nodded, impressed, but mentally bracing for the next leg of field work. Wolfe's deductions were never wrong, but they always required legwork to supply him with the raw observations. And legwork meant I was about to spend long hours in kitchens, warehouses, and back alleys, tracing subtle hands, subtle moves, subtle sabotage. My first personal encounter with potential intrigue occurred at a small supplier's storage unit in Brooklyn. I had been trailing the meticulous courier, Lewis, who had just dropped off a batch of Tarragon. I watched as he lingered near a side door, supposedly checking a crate. I approached casually, pretending to inspect shipping labels, but my ears picked up a faint conversation. "Everything in place for tomorrow?" A low voice whispered. "Yes. No mistakes," Lewis replied, his tone sharp. "Follow the pattern, or the boss notices." Pattern. Boss. The words were small, easily missed, but my pen was already scratching in the notebook. Someone was coordinating from behind the scenes, giving instructions to couriers, perhaps even within the company. I left before being noticed, ducking into an alley to jot notes. The pieces were starting to fit altered Tarragon batches, precisely timed deliveries, reactions from chefs and management, and now evidence of an orchestrator giving instructions to the very people moving the spice. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe analyzing my latest report, eyes glinting. "Good," he said. "You have now traced the vectors of influence, documented the intermediaries, and noted the subtle disruptions. The groundwork for exposure is laid. Observation alone will reveal the orchestration. But timing is crucial. The next disruption must be monitored with precision." I realized then that Wolfe had already begun anticipating the next move of the saboteur. He had identified the manipulators, the executioners, and the likely psychological effects on the chefs. My job was simple in comparison: track, observe, and feed him the raw data. As the evening light fell through the brownstone windows, I sat back, cigarette in hand, and admired the chessboard we had set. Each piece, Rains, Harrow, Marks, Dean, Lewis, was positioned with precision, and somewhere among them the mastermind continued their silent campaign, unaware that Wolfe's eye, even if stationary, could see the invisible threads connecting every move, every hesitation, every altered jar of Tarragon. The investigation was now fully underway, and I knew the next 24 hours would reveal whether the saboteur was merely cautious or foolishly overconfident. Either way, the brownstone had claimed its first strategic victory: patience, observation, and intellectual rigor over noise, haste, and deception. It began with something almost imperceptible. I noticed it first in the early morning hours as I returned from a long night tracing Lewis's delivery patterns. Wolfe was seated in his usual chair, legs crossed, eyes closed, but his nostrils flared slightly, catching some scent I couldn't name. "Archie," he said finally, voice calm but precise. "Tell me, have you accounted for the condition of the spice cabinet this morning?" I frowned. "Condition? Inspect it," he said simply. "A subtle rearrangement occurred overnight. I need to know who touched what, when, and why." I went to the kitchen, noting every jar, every label, the alignment of shelves, and the faint traces of tarragon in the air. Something was off. The jars were slightly shifted, not enough to be immediately noticeable, but enough for a trained eye or a meticulous saboteur to make a difference. The spices themselves seemed undisturbed in content, but the alignment, the sequence, the minor scuff marks on the wood, these were fingerprints, if not literal, then figurative. Whoever had entered the brownstone's sacred kitchen had done so with precision, knowledge, and restraint. "Did you see anything?" Wolfe asked when I returned. "Yes and no," I replied. "Someone has been here, moved things just enough to indicate familiarity with your system, but left nothing overtly wrong. Whoever it is, they know what they're doing." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "The manipulation is subtle. An act of trespass designed to observe, to learn, perhaps to unsettle. Yet it is controlled, intentional. Note that intent, Goodwin. This is no random intrusion. I had my suspicions. There were only a handful of people with enough knowledge of our internal arrangements to pull this off without causing obvious chaos. Fritz, obviously, and the suspects connected to Marwick & Co. But Fritz had the courtesy to leave no trace, and he was in the kitchen the entire night. That left only outsiders. I returned to the spice cabinet, this time with more scrutiny. There was a faint smudge near the top shelf, a barely noticeable fingerprint that someone with gloves might still leave if the material beneath was fine enough. I made a note. Whoever entered had done so in darkness, carefully, and with a mental map of the brownstone's interior. Later that morning, I ventured back to the streets, following Lewis's route again, hoping for some small clue that might explain the audacious intrusion. It was unusual for someone to tamper both inside the warehouse and within our brownstone. That implied audacity or desperation. At one stop, I observed Lewis handing over a crate to an unfamiliar man at a side street. They exchanged no words, only a brief nod. The crate bore subtle signs of handling the same minor smudges and shifts I had noticed in the brownstone. I scribbled the details, noting the time, location, and faces. Someone else was involved, someone directing or receiving these altered shipments. Returning to Wolfe, I laid out the observations. There's a network. Lewis isn't acting alone. Someone inside Marwick & Co. or nearby is coordinating these subtle intrusions. The fingerprints in the brownstone match the handling patterns of this crate. Wolfe's eyes opened briefly, then narrowed. And the intent? To destabilize, I said, not to steal, not to ruin outright, but to make the chefs doubt themselves, to create confusion, to subtly undermine confidence in Marwick's products. Exactly, Wolfe said. The act of trespass is secondary. Psychological manipulation is primary. Observe, Goodwin, the timing of the intrusions. Note any patterns of access, frequency, and proximity to key personnel. I spent the rest of the afternoon retracing courier steps, visiting kitchens, and noting discrepancies between shipment logs and actual deliveries. The picture became clearer with small adjustments, subtle delays, and perfectly timed entries, all pointing toward a coordinated effort. Whoever was responsible had intimate knowledge of both the supply chain and human behavior. When I returned to the brownstone that evening, Wolfe had assembled a small map of observations. He pointed to each location, each person, each anomaly. Here, he said, tapping the corner of a page, and here. Both correspond to times of subtle disruption. Patterns? I asked. Yes, he replied. The saboteur seeks predictability, yet thrives on doubt. Timing is precise, manipulations minimal, yet consistent enough to be noticed by those sensitive to discrepancy. The combination of audacity, subtlety, and knowledge narrows the suspect field considerably. I lit a cigarette and studied the notes. It was remarkable, almost theatrical, how someone could commit minor crimes with such intellectual precision. The act itself might seem trivial, shifting jars, slightly off deliveries, but the purpose was far more insidious. Over the next 2 days, I continued shadowing deliveries, documenting interactions and noting subtle gestures, a quick glance over a shoulder, hesitation before a hand touched a crate, a casual frown at a delivery log. Each micro-behavior added to the growing understanding of our saboteur. The final piece came unexpectedly. In one of the warehouses, I noticed a ledger left open on a desk, a single entry misaligned with the rest. It was subtle enough that most would overlook it, but I didn't. The misalignment corresponded to the days the brownstone had been subtly intruded upon. Whoever had access to this ledger had orchestrated the minor shifts in jars and containers, testing, observing, adjusting. I returned once more to Wolfe, who received my report with a silent nod. "Good," he said. "You have documented both the network and the intrusions. You have seen the fingerprints of intent, the cadence of the manipulations, and the behavioral deviations. Now the stage is set for the next phase: pressure, observation, and timing. Subtle trespass alone is insufficient. We must provoke a response without revealing our hand." I flicked ash into the tray, feeling the tension tighten. The saboteur had crossed boundaries, both physical and psychological, but Wolfe's methodical patience promised that the next steps would reveal everything. Subtle trespass, it seemed, was just the opening move in a game that demanded precision, intellect, and timing. And somewhere out there, the mastermind had no idea their delicate operations were being observed, analyzed, and poised for exposure. The brownstone remained serene, yet beneath its calm the currents of strategic intrigue were now flowing strongly, carrying each of us toward the inevitable confrontation. The moment of subtle trespass had passed, but the atmosphere around Marek & Co. was thickening with tension. Wolfe had been analyzing my notes, cross-referencing delivery inconsistencies with behavioral observations, when a second anomaly arrived, a late-night call from Helena Marwick. "The Tarragon shipment for tomorrow morning has been tampered with again," she said, voice tight with frustration. I examined the crates personally, labels swapped, jars shifted, and one sealed container slightly cracked. "Whoever is doing this is escalating." Wolfe leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Escalation is a sign of desperation or confidence," he said calmly. "Prepare to leave immediately, Goodwin. I want precise details on timing, routes, and anyone with proximity to the storage facilities in the last 48 hours. I slipped into the evening streets, cigarette lit, blending with the shadows. The city was quieter than usual, but every alley, every loading dock, every warehouse corridor had its own rhythm. I traced the deliveries, noted who handled crates, and observed patterns with heightened attention. The subtle sabotage had now evolved into a more aggressive form, one that required both boldness and planning. At the first warehouse, I found the meticulous courier, Lewis, nervously checking over a shipment. He hesitated when he noticed me, fingers pausing mid-crate, eyes flicking to the nearby manager. That pause, brief though it was, revealed more than words ever could. Someone was watching him closely, and he feared being observed. As I followed the crates through their evening routes, I realized that someone else had become involved in a shadowy figure appearing at key handoffs, never speaking, simply ensuring the altered jars reached their intended destinations. The figure was deliberate, unobtrusive, almost ghost-like. The precision suggested an insider, someone with authority or at least familiarity with the schedules and routines. Back at Marwick & Co., Chef Harrow reported subtle disturbances in kitchen preparation. A spice rack slightly misaligned, a jar out of place, but these were items she would have noticed only because of her meticulous nature. Wolfe's deductions had predicted exactly this type of psychological pressure. The saboteur aimed not to damage the product outright, but to destabilize confidence. I documented each anomaly, each reaction, and relayed them back to the brownstone. Wolfe was waiting, poised like a hawk, reviewing patterns and making connections that would have been invisible to anyone else. "The escalated intrusion," he said, tapping his fingers on the table, "is a critical point. Observe carefully. Goodwin the saboteur is testing boundaries. They seek to see how quickly their manipulations are detected and how effectively the psychological impact spreads. This is more than tampering, it is surveillance with intent." The next morning, I returned to the streets, following the now familiar route of the shipments. The same shadowy figure appeared again, coordinating silently with Lewis and another employee I hadn't noticed before a stock clerk named Murray. Their movements were precise, almost choreographed, suggesting prior planning. Every handoff, every shift of a jar was executed with controlled intent. At one delivery point, I observed the cracked jar that Helena had mentioned. The contents were intact, but the seal was compromised. I photographed it, noting the time, the person who handled it last, and the subtle variations in packaging compared to earlier shipments. Whoever had done this wanted someone to notice, wanted the effect amplified. Returning to the brownstone with my observations, I found Wolfe arranging a small chart of patterns on his desk. "You see," he said, "each subtle disruption, each deliberate delay, and each psychological adjustment is a move on a board only we fully comprehend. The escalated pressure is a signal the perpetrator believes. They are unobserved, yet they have exposed themselves through method and timing." I lit a cigarette, thinking through the implications. The saboteur was clever, methodical and confident, yet overconfident. Escalation often precedes mistakes, and Wolfe's patient eye was already noting the edges of this network, the links between couriers, clerks, and potential orchestrators within Morrick & Co. Later that afternoon, I shadowed Lewis to an inconspicuous side street near a small, privately leased warehouse. The shadowy figure followed him at a distance, keeping pace but never overtly interacting. I ducked into an alley, observing quietly as Lewis handed off a crate to the figure. The crate bore subtle signs I had seen in the brownstone labels, slightly misaligned, faint smudges, a jar resting at an angle, inconsistent with standard packing. This was no longer subtle tampering. Someone was directly orchestrating the manipulation, ensuring that evidence of intrusion would reach key personnel, all while remaining unseen. The pattern was deliberate, intelligent, and audacious. Returning to the brownstone, I reported my findings. Wolfe absorbed every detail, cross-referencing them with previous observations. "Pressure applied," he said slowly, "reveals weakness. The saboteur believes in invisibility. In reality, they are exposing the very structure of their scheme. We now have the opportunity to provoke the next move, to observe their reactions under controlled conditions." I understood immediately Wolfe was preparing for a controlled confrontation. He didn't need to chase the saboteur. He needed to manipulate circumstances so that the perpetrator's own moves would betray them. As evening fell, the brownstone itself seemed to hold its breath. The kitchen smelled faintly of tarragon, a reminder of the central object of contention. Wolfe remained poised in his chair, analyzing patterns and anticipating the saboteur's next step, while I, his field operative, prepared for the inevitable escalation. The pressure was no longer theoretical. The saboteur had responded to the initial subtle intrusions with increasingly bold manipulations. Each act, carefully timed and executed, was a clue waiting to be interpreted, and Wolfe, ever patient, would ensure that every detail, every hesitation, and every misstep would ultimately reveal the mastermind behind the scheme. By the time I returned to the brownstone that evening, Wolfe had already begun positioning his pieces. I found him in his usual chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on a small diagram of delivery routes and kitchen layouts he had spread across his desk. The patience in his posture contrasted sharply with the tension that had been mounting over the past few days. He didn't need to leave the room. Every calculation, every strategic maneuver would be orchestrated from here. "Goodwin," he said without looking up, "we have reached the stage where observation alone will no longer suffice. The saboteur has escalated, and now we must induce a response that will betray intention, timing, and affiliation. Are you prepared to act under my direction?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, studying the chart. It was a meticulous record of every shipment, courier, and kitchen response. Each line connected dots that only Wolfe could see, revealing not just what had happened, but the potential for what was about to occur. "Good," he said, tapping a finger against the desk. "We will proceed by indirect confrontation. The goal is not to catch the perpetrator in the act of theft, but to provoke an error in judgment and exposure born of overconfidence or overreach." I nodded. In Wolfe's world, positioning wasn't physical, it was psychological. He would manipulate events, control information, and let the saboteur incriminate themselves through their own actions. Over the next day, I followed the couriers again, but under Wolfe's subtle instructions, I allowed certain deliveries to be slightly delayed, others reordered. The minor variations were enough to create ripples in the pattern. I documented every reaction, glances exchanged, hesitations, quick adjustments. Each was a potential thread leading toward the central manipulator. Wolfe, meanwhile, reviewed the incoming reports with almost surgical attention. "Observe the variations," he instructed. "Note which personnel respond predictably and which display uncertainty. The latter will guide us closer to the source of orchestration." By late afternoon, I noticed a crucial detail. The shadowy figure who had been coordinating altered shipments was now more visible, though still careful. They lingered longer at handoffs, glanced frequently toward entrances, and, most tellingly, appeared to confer silently with Lewis. It was a small crack in the armor, a deviation from the previously flawless precision. I returned to the brownstone and reported my observations. Wolfe's eyes glimmered, a rare sign of intellectual satisfaction. "Exactly," he said. "The saboteur is testing boundaries again. Their confidence has led to observable deviation. Timing, attention, and micro-behavioral cues are now in our favor. It is only a matter of applying pressure strategically to force further disclosure." That evening, Wolfe summoned me to the study with instructions. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will manipulate a shipment under the guise of routine. All alterations will be subtle, predictable, yet calculated to provoke reaction. I do not require action on your part beyond observation and documentation. The field is prepared and the pieces will move themselves." I spent the night reviewing past patterns, revisiting courier routes, and preparing mentally for the next day's orchestrated moves. It was clear that whoever was behind the Tarragon manipulations had underestimated Wolfe's ability to predict human behavior, to anticipate subtle escalation, and to use observation as a weapon. The next morning, I followed Lewis on what seemed to be a standard delivery route. Unbeknownst to him, the crates had been pre-marked according to Wolfe's instructions, slight misalignments, carefully timed shifts, just enough to suggest human error while remaining controlled. The shadowy figure appeared again, and I observed closely. They adjusted the crates, checking labels, scanning their surroundings, but there was a slight hesitation, a subtle miscalculation introduced by Wolfe's premeditated positioning. It was a small imperfection, almost imperceptible, but to Wolfe it was a sign of vulnerability. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe reviewed my notes. "Observe, He said how confidence wavers when the environment changes subtly. The saboteur is now forced to choose between action that maintains appearances and action that risks exposure. Every adjustment they make is a window into strategy, motive, and identity. Over the course of the afternoon, the orchestrator's moves became more erratic. A delivery intended to arrive at 2:15 was delayed by a mere 7 minutes, but it was enough to cause a ripple through the chef's schedules. The shadowy figure lingered, checking and double-checking, signaling Lewis in brief, urgent gestures. Each micro-movement was a puzzle piece, revealing intent and affiliation without a word spoken. I relayed all observations to Wolfe, who began connecting the dots with ruthless precision. Goodwin, he said, noted the convergence of timing, handling, and psychological manipulation. Each act, while appearing minor, now forms a pattern, a deliberate orchestration designed to control perception, manipulate confidence, and obscure culpability. By evening, Wolfe had completed his diagram, showing the saboteur's network, the conduits of influence, and the points at which pressure could be applied. Tomorrow, he said, we will create conditions for exposure. The saboteur believes themselves in control. In reality, the outcome is predetermined. Your role is to witness and document, and do not interfere. I understood exactly what he meant. The brownstone itself, silent and commanding, was a tool. Wolfe's positioning had transformed the environment into a controlled stage, each player moving under subtle influence, each micro-decision feeding the larger picture. As I prepared for another night of surveillance, I realized the saboteur's audacity had become their weakness. Every manipulation, every calculated risk had left a trail. And Wolfe, from the comfort of his chair, had arranged circumstances so that the perpetrator's own overconfidence would lead them straight into exposure. The game was no longer merely observation and deduction. It had become a strategic battle of intellect, timing, and human psychology, with Wolfe's positioning dictating the moves before the first confrontation even occurred. The saboteur, confident and careful, was walking a path laid out entirely by the mind of Nero Wolfe. The morning arrived with the kind of stillness only the brownstone can enforce. Even the street outside seemed subdued, as if aware that a quiet reckoning was about to occur. Wolfe had summoned everyone to his office: Helena Marwick, Chef Harrow, Reginald Marks, Lewis, and the enigmatic stock clerk, Murray. The tension was palpable, a current running beneath the polished surfaces of polite greeting and reserved postures. I stood slightly to the side, observing, recording, and noting the smallest shifts in expression, the faintest twitch of a hand. Wolfe sat behind his desk, legs crossed, hands folded, radiating an immovable authority. His eyes, dark and unyielding, surveyed the room with the precision of a surgeon assessing tissue. No one dared misstep. "Good morning," Wolfe began, voice calm but sharp. "I have called you here to discuss a matter of both intellectual and practical importance. Recent events involving the manipulation of certain products have caused confusion, inconvenience, and, in some cases, concern. I intend to clarify those events and their causes." Marks shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "Detective Wolfe, I assure you our company's procedures are rigorous. Any anomalies are regrettable, but they are purely accidental." Wolfe's gaze never left him. Accidents leave no patterns. Yet patterns have emerged. Delays, subtle alterations, shifts in handling, and psychological effects on the chefs have been observed and recorded. I will need each of you to provide information regarding your actions, observations, and knowledge of the relevant processes. Helena Marwick, standing beside her satchel of documents, nodded. "Of course, Mr. Wolfe. I have been monitoring shipments and product quality closely, and I can provide records and observations." Lewis and Murray exchanged a glance, subtle, almost imperceptible. The tension in their shoulders suggested awareness beyond casual compliance. Wolfe noted this. First, Wolfe continued, let us consider the deliveries over the past month. There have been subtle but deliberate disruptions. Who handled each batch and under what supervision? Mark spoke first. The couriers and warehouse staff, everything is logged. Lewis and Murray are responsible for routine deliveries with oversight from the warehouse manager. Wolfe nodded slightly. And deviations? Instances of altered alignment? Damaged containers or delayed arrivals? Minor, Marks replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Nothing beyond human error. I noticed Wolfe's lips twitch, a suppressed indication of interest. He had already observed that these minor deviations were anything but accidental. Miss Harrow, Wolfe said, shifting focus, you have reported anomalies in your kitchens. Explain the nature of these disruptions and your observations regarding timing, delivery, and product condition. Harrow spoke with precision, describing delayed shipments, misaligned spice racks, and slight variations in aroma. Her hands, however, betrayed subtle frustration, moving almost unconsciously as she recounted each incident. Wolfe noted every micro-gesture, every pause, every nuanced reaction. And you, Lewis and Murray, Wolfe continued, have you noticed any unusual instructions, unusual interactions, or deviations from standard procedure? Lewis hesitated, fingers tightening slightly. Occasionally there were instructions from someone higher up, asking for checks, minor adjustments. Nothing out of the ordinary, I thought at the time. Murray remained silent, but his eyes flicked toward Lewis in a way that suggested complicity, or at least knowledge of coordination. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Coordination, he murmured, almost to himself. Then, addressing the room, the pattern is clear. There exists an orchestrator, someone leveraging knowledge of routines, human psychology, and access to manipulate both product and perception. Every individual, while perhaps unwittingly involved, has contributed to this effect. Mark stiffened. You're suggesting someone within our organization is responsible? Not merely within, Wolfe said. The orchestrator has exploited the network of couriers, clerks, and internal oversight. They have employed subtlety, precision, and timing to achieve their ends. The question is who, and why? I watched as eyes shifted nervously around the room. Wolfe, in his methodical, calculated fashion, had created an environment in which each individual's reactions would betray them, even without direct accusation. Consider, Wolfe continued, the acts themselves, slight misalignments, minor delays, minimal physical interference. Each act is designed to provoke doubt, disrupt confidence, and destabilize perception without causing outright damage. The orchestrator's goal is intellectual, psychological, not merely practical. Helena Marwick spoke then, voice measured. That matches exactly what I feared. Reputation, trust, confidence are subtly undermined. That was why I brought this matter to you. Wolfe nodded slightly. Indeed, and your observations combined with field reports allow us to identify patterns, alignments, and vulnerabilities. From these, we can deduce both method and motive. He paused, eyes sweeping the room. It is now clear who has had opportunity, knowledge, and access, who has manipulated the chain of events while relying on subtlety and misdirection. The evidence lies not in overt acts, but in patterns, reactions, and psychological footprints. Each of you has contributed, knowingly or not, but only one individual orchestrated the sequence deliberately, with calculated intent. The room grew heavier, breaths measured, tension tightening like a drum. Wolfe leaned back, hands resting calmly, eyes observing, listening, calculating. Each subtle twitch, each micro-expression, each faltering word was another thread woven into the net that would ensnare the mastermind. Now, Wolfe said, his voice calm, unyielding, we will proceed to clarify the final links. Observation alone has brought us to this threshold. I will ask questions, you will answer, and truth, subtle, careful, undeniable truth will emerge. The game, carefully orchestrated over days of observation, shadowing, and manipulation, had reached its controlled climax. The office was no longer merely a space, it was a stage, the players unknowingly enacting moves that Wolfe had anticipated and arranged. Each reaction, hesitation, and glance was a piece of evidence, feeding the intellect of the detective seated behind his desk. I sat silently, watching, recording, understanding that the final unveiling was imminent. In the brownstone, strategy and intellect had replaced chaos. The orchestrator's subtle maneuvers, clever though they were, had been anticipated. And soon every carefully constructed layer of deception would be exposed not through confrontation, not through force, but through the relentless precision of observation and deduction. The room was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as Wolfe fixed each person with a gaze that seemed to pierce through layers of pretense. The evidence, subtle and carefully accumulated, had led to this moment. Every act of manipulation, every hesitant glance, every delayed shipment now formed a coherent picture, one that only Wolfe could unravel with such precision. "Let us begin with the obvious," Wolfe said, voice calm, deliberate. The pattern of subtle disruptions, the minor alterations in product alignment, the timing of deliveries, and the reactions of each participant have been meticulously observed and recorded. These are not the actions of chance or accident. They are deliberate, calculated, and coordinated. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We have determined that multiple individuals were involved, but only one mind orchestrated the sequence. That mind is aware of human psychology, supply chain logistics, and the precise effects of subtle manipulation. The goal is to destabilize confidence, create doubt, and undermine trust, all without overt damage. Marks shifted, face pale. "You mean yes," Wolfe interrupted, voice unwavering. "You have been involved, Mr. Marks, in facilitating certain movements, knowingly or unknowingly, but the architect of the scheme is another." He turned slightly, eyes narrowing, and fixed Lewis with an intensity that made the young courier visibly uncomfortable. "Lewis, your role has been executed with care, but it has been under guidance. You followed instructions, you moved the shipments, you ensured the subtle misalignments, but you did not conceive the plan." Lewis swallowed, glancing at Murray, whose silence had spoken volumes over the past days. "The orchestrator," Wolfe continued, "is someone with access both to the internal operations and to the individuals executing the manipulations. Someone who understands the routines, the timing, and the human reactions that would follow. The subtle fingerprints left at the brownstone, the minor shifts, the cracked jar, these were intended to provoke observation, to test the system, and to measure response." Harrow's eyes widened. "You mean someone knew we would notice that they wanted us to notice?" "Precisely," Wolfe said. "The mastermind calculated that the psychological impact would amplify the effect of each minor intrusion. By causing doubt and confusion, they achieved disruption greater than mere physical tampering could accomplish." He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping to a precise cadence. "And the individual responsible is Murray." The stock clerk's eyes went wide, hand twitching toward the table. Or whose don't understand Wolfe's gaze held him, unyielding. "You were familiar with delivery schedules, internal layouts, and personnel habits. You coordinated with Lewis and leveraged Mark's oversight to implement subtle, timed disruptions. The misalignments in crates, the adjustments to shipment timing, the faint traces at the brownstone, these were all orchestrated under your direction." Murray's composure crumbled. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I just wanted to test the system, see if anyone noticed, if the company paid attention. I didn't mean to cause real trouble." Wolfe's lips tightened in a thin line. "Intent is irrelevant to method. You used subtlety, psychology, and opportunity to manipulate outcomes. You trespassed, disrupted operations, and endangered the confidence of those relying on this network. Observation and deduction have now made the invisible visible. Helena Marwick's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. I suspected someone close to the operation, but I could not identify who had both the access and the cunning. Exactly, Wolfe said. Only by meticulous observation, careful documentation, and analysis of patterns could the orchestrator be revealed without direct confrontation. Each participant's reactions, micro-expressions, and hesitations were critical. Each minor deviation contributed to the final identification. I watched as Murray sank into his chair, head bowed. The subtle cracks in his confidence, the faltering words, and the half-denied gestures had all been noted and interpreted. Wolfe's method was complete. No physical chase, no threat of force, only intellectual exposure. "Lewis," Wolfe said, turning to the courier, "your diligence has been exemplary, though misdirected under guidance. Your role was to execute, not to conceive. Your observations, however, have been invaluable in confirming the orchestrator's strategy." Lewis exhaled shakily. "I just followed instructions. I didn't know it would be like this." Wolfe's voice remained precise. "Caution and obedience without comprehension are insufficient shields against responsibility. However, your intent and method are distinct from Murray's orchestration. You acted as instructed. He created the framework and the manipulations." Marks leaned back, face ashen. "I see now I only followed procedures. I didn't realize I had been part of a coordinated plan." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "your actions were consistent with oversight and routine. The true orchestrator understood these routines and exploited them. Murray, you did not merely act. You engineered, manipulated, and observed for the purpose of psychological disruption." Harrow's voice trembled slightly. "All this just over Tarragon." Wolfe's gaze did not waver. "Tarragon is incidental. The crime is intellectual, psychological. The disruption of trust, confidence, and perception is the issue, not the physical object. The medium is spice. The message is strategy." Murray finally raised his eyes, redrimmed, understanding the full weight of Wolfe's words. "I didn't think it would hurt people, cause confusion. I just wanted to see if I could do it without anyone noticing." "You have learned," Wolfe said quietly, "that actions, even those intended as tests or intellectual exercises, have consequences. Observation, analysis, and deduction have revealed those consequences. The system and those operating within it are now aware of both method and motive." I exhaled slowly, cigarette in hand, marveling at the precision of Wolfe's orchestration. The orchestrator had been revealed not through confrontation or force, but through the patient accumulation of observation, the careful control of circumstances, and the application of intellectual pressure. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closing briefly. The final truth is thus laid bare. Intent, method, and consequence converge. Murray, you will face the moral and professional repercussions of your actions. The network of complicity has been clarified, and the principles of justice, intellectual and ethical, have been satisfied without a single physical altercation. Helena Marwick exhaled in relief, though still measured. "I am grateful for your clarity, Mr. Wolfe. The disruption can now be corrected and trust restored." Wolfe's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. Trust, once tested, must be restored carefully. Observation and correction are one understanding, and prevention are the next steps. The game is concluded, yet the lesson remains. Intellect, strategy, and morality are inseparable, even in matters as seemingly trivial as a jar of tarragon. I noted every word, every glance, and every subtle shift in expression, knowing that Wolfe's revelation had done more than expose the saboteur. It had reinforced the principle that intellect, patience, and strategy always prevail over deception and arrogance. The orchestrator's final move had been anticipated, observed, and rendered ineffective. The brownstone, serene yet vigilant, had claimed another victory. The brownstone had settled into its familiar rhythm, but there was a residual tension in the air, like the echo of a distant storm. Wolfe remained in his chair, immovable and calm, eyes closed, fingers steepled. The orchestrator had been revealed, the pattern of deception laid bare, yet the subtle energies of intellect and human reaction lingered in the corners of the room. I wandered into the kitchen, where Fritz was already arranging dinner. The aroma of roasted chicken and carefully seasoned vegetables mingled with the faint trace of tarragona reminded us of the central object of our recent investigation. "Even after all that," I said, exhaling smoke, "you still managed to make this place smell like a restaurant worth fighting over." Fritz glanced at me, a slight smile breaking his usual solemn composure. "Sir, the kitchen must maintain dignity even when the intellect of others has caused disruption. Dinner shall proceed as usual. Mr. Wolfe's appetite will not be denied, nor shall the house's equilibrium." I returned to the study, noting how Wolfe had arranged the evidence, the diagrams, and the observational notes with meticulous precision. Each sheet, each mark, was now a testament to both method and consequence. He opened one eye as if sensing my presence. "Goodwin," he said, voice calm, measured, observing how order has been restored not merely physically but intellectually. The network has been clarified, responsibility established, and the chain of influence documented. Yet it is not the exposure alone that matters. It is the understanding that intellectual misdeeds, however subtle, carry weight. I took a slow drag of my cigarette, leaning back. "So the Tarragon was just the medium, huh? The real game was in psychology and manipulation." Wolfe's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. "Exactly. A subtle manipulation of perception is more insidious than direct interference. It challenges judgment, erodes trust, and destabilizes confidence. The orchestrator underestimated the power of observation, the precision of deduction, and the inevitability of exposure under careful scrutiny. Helena Marwick, who had returned briefly to ensure proper documentation, nodded. I can see that now. The orchestrator had knowledge, but they lacked perspective, a broader understanding of consequences and observation. "Indeed," Wolfe said, "intent without foresight is insufficient when faced with methodical analysis. The manipulation was intellectual, but the consequences, both moral and practical, are unavoidable." I glanced around the room. Marx had quietly left after offering a brief acknowledgement of procedural oversight. Lewis had been reassigned under direct supervision, and Murray, the orchestrator, was escorted by Helena to face both professional and ethical consequences. The chain of command, influence, and responsibility had been clarified. Fritz called us to the dining table, and the aroma of dinner filled the room. Wolfe remained poised, the very image of calm dominance, as he took his place. I slid into my chair across from him, noting the faint satisfaction in his posture. "Dinner," Wolfe said, "is both sustenance and reflection. After the resolution of disruption, one must consider not merely what has occurred, but why. Intellectual misdeeds, subtle as they may be, carry both consequence and lesson. Let us proceed with the former and contemplate the latter." As we ate, I observed Wolfe in his rare, reflective silence. There was no gloating, no overt triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of an intellect fulfilled. Each bite was deliberate, each gesture measured, and yet the undercurrent of authority was unmistakable. I couldn't resist a quip. "You know, boss, I think we've finally proven that even Tarragon can't outwit you." Wolfe's lips twitched. "Observation and deduction are rarely outwitted, Goodwin. The subtlety of Tarragon or any other medium is irrelevant when the mind is trained to discern patterns, motive, and method Remember that? I nodded, silently appreciating the precision of his statement. The orchestrator had acted with audacity, intelligence, and subtlety, but Wolfe's patience, foresight, and methodical positioning had rendered every action transparent. It was a lesson in strategy, human nature, and intellectual justice. Helena Marwick watched as Wolfe organized the remaining documents, her expression a mixture of respect and relief. "I cannot thank you enough," she said softly, "not just for exposing the orchestrator, but for clarifying the subtleties that I could not see myself." Wolfe merely nodded. Clarity is a function of observation, analysis, and understanding. It is not provided lightly, nor is it granted without evidence. Your trust, Miss Marwick, was well placed, yet the demonstration of consequence is the true lesson. I leaned back, finishing my meal, considering the day's events. The brownstone had been disrupted, subtly invaded, yet the order had been restored. The orchestrator had underestimated patience, intellect, and observation, and the resolution was both moral and practical. The subtlety of the crime was outmatched by the precision of deduction. As dinner concluded, Wolfe allowed a rare reflection. Human folly, even in minor acts, is amplified by confidence and opportunity. When intellect is applied with foresight and careful observation, such acts are exposed, understood, and corrected. That is the principle that governs not merely this investigation, but all acts of subtle manipulation. I exhaled, appreciating the depth of his observation. So, the lesson is clear. Even clever manipulation can't survive careful attention and a keen mind. Wolfe's eyes closed again, the slight nod indicating agreement. The brownstone had returned to its serene state, yet beneath the calm, the intellectual currents of observation and deduction remained alive, ready to respond to any future challenge. I finished my cigarette, noting the quiet satisfaction in the room. The orchestrator had been revealed, the network clarified, and the lessons of subtle manipulation, psychological influence, and intellectual justice had been firmly established. The game was over, the board cleared, yet the principles remained. Observation, strategy, and intellect had prevailed. The brownstone, in its serene dominance, had once again asserted the order of logic, ethics, and consequence. And Wolfe, immovable and precise, had delivered the final commentary. Human folly is most evident when subtlety is misjudged, and the price of oversight is invariably exposed. Dinner concluded, I made a mental note of the quiet victory. The orchestrator had been caught, the subtle sabotage undone, and the integrity of Marwick & Co. restored. The brownstone, silent yet vigilant, remained the centre of intellect, strategy, and moral clarity. And as always, Wolfe had won not through force, not through confrontation, but through patience, observation, and unyielding logic.